As you know, on the Quién Tú Eres podcast, we talk about the conflict that we often face between professionalism and authenticity. Before we get into professionalism, though, let's start with the word authenticity. Such a buzzword. We hear it everywhere. What does it mean to you?
Okay. So before diving in, I have to say thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the Quién Tú Eres podcast. I've been following you for a hot minute on LinkedIn, and I love how you show up and the work you're doing to address the stigmas and stereotypes that cause members of the Latinx community to compromise who they are, to hold back. As cliche as it sounds, being authentic to me means showing up as your whole multidimensional self. And we were chatting earlier, it's really easier said than done. I think it takes like super amount of courage to really put yourself out there and keep it real, especially in predominantly white workspaces, which I've been navigating for most of my career. Um, and it's, I think it gets easier with time for me, but it's 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 whack because it can be seen as like showing up authentically. For me, when I look at it, it's like a calculated risk, and being yourself can be perceived as like a brand reputational risk for your personal brand and maybe the organization you work for. If you're in a senior level, if you have a highly visible role, if you're working for a really big brand. And I'm not trying to be dramatic or hyperbolic. I mean, the stereotypes, stigmas, prejudice, all the isms, the institutional racism, these are real threats to our livelihood. It's not a drill, like we see all the stats and the injustices in employment and housing and schooling and healthcare. They're all connected. It's super well documented, and they often play out regardless of your accomplishments or credentials. So I think, um, I've learned to try and embrace my authentic self, but I know I shift, depending on the environment I'm in to just avoid any risks. Who wants to fall victim to stigmas or stereotypes? Not me.
Nah, it's real. I don't think you're being dramatic at all. I think to your point, like there's so much research and stats and experiences that have been shared to validate what you're talking about. I'm curious in that authenticity you referenced, bringing your whole self. Was that easy for you at a young age?
No, I mean, it's not something that I feel like, we're all like super multidimensional. I'm a mom, I'm a yogi, I'm a DEI practitioner, I'm a badass marketer, I'm a leader. I love music, I love culture, I love my people, but I feel like I've been very good at compartmentalizing different parts of my identity depending on the environment that I'm in. So I think it's like you learn to be a chameleon, to adapt, to mitigate risk, to maximize opportunities, to connect with the people you need to connect with to get where you need to go. And I'm not trying to sound opportunistic. It's just, I think, a survival mechanism. So it's not something that has been particularly taxing. I think it's just kind of become a way of operating in corporate and higher ed. So
Yeah.
it's it's tricky, and it's funny because like being in the DEI space, like I'm so vested in, developing strategies and policies and systems that will create the environments where people feel comfortable to show up as they are, their full multidimensional self. But this work is hard. And I think, outside of what's written on paper and these policies and practices, I think authenticity, we were talking about earlier, breeds authenticity. And I think it's a behavior that needs to be modeled. And when people can, be vulnerable, they can keep it real and be professional and also be personable and stay true to who they are. I think that's creates a ripple effect. And we're starting to see that. And at least I'm starting to feel it, like even connecting with you and LinkedIn and starting to be more mindful about my community in the digital space. I feel like more at ease, more inspired to show up more fully and more wholly. But it's definitely a journey,
Yeah.
something I'm working on straight up. I'm like,
Oh, we're all working on it. That chameleon reference resonates with me. And I always thought for so long until I did a lot of self-reflection. I was like, oh, that chameleon journey started in corporate America, right? When I started working. But then I thought about it, I was like, yo, I started that in like elementary school.
for sure.
Like my first instance probably of hiding a little bit of myself to make people feel comfortable was when someone asked me what my name was. And in that moment I had to make a slight not a slight but a rapid decision to be like, is it Pavel? Because that's how my name is pronounced. That's how my mom decided
Right.
to have it. But in that moment I looked around me and I was like, oh no, I have to make people feel comfortable. My name is Pavel. And that's just when I
Oh,
went
wow.
with moving forward, right?
Yeah.
But that
Doesn't
like
have the same flag.
nah.
Sorry.
But in that moment, that was like a very small decision, but I think it was like almost making me feel comfortable in letting myself go a little bit. Like,
Yeah.
what was it for you? Do you remember like at an
I
early
mean,
stage, just like what was it for you that like you started to maybe be a chameleon, like you referenced?
I think there's just these little, they're like micro actions that you do. So similar, like my name is Kayla Santalla. Double L in Spanish is like a Y. But in school, Kayla Santalla, you pronounce it a certain way. Um, I think, depending, when you start going into different spaces, you might shift your dress and the way you speak. And it's just these things that you do to, I've never really like to, yeah, to fit in.
Yeah.
Um,
It almost becomes like second nature. Like you don't even realize you're doing it. At least that was for me.
no,
It
for me,
almost,
it's
yeah,
been like breathing.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I always just felt like I'm so proud of my background, so proud of my parents, my culture. My mom's Jamaican, she's a Black woman, she's a Rasta, she has dreadlocks. My dad's Cuban. Um, my husband's Cuban. We speak Spanish at home. We have, strong like spiritual background. But all of those cultural identities, they all come with stigmas that I feel like I don't open up about who I am to different people. If it's like, oh, you're from Jamaica and your mom has dreadlocks, oh, you might be pinpointed as somebody who's like a burnout or somebody who smokes weed.
mm,
If, you know, you listen to a certain type of music, people might think, oh, you're risque or promiscuous or a party girl. So I just have always been a go-getter and hyper focused on creating a really, stable life for myself and excelling academically, professionally, and so forth, and fitting into this capitalistic grind. And it's quite frankly just a survival practice to
yeah,
survive and thrive. And there's a lot of talk around like thriving, and I'm happy about it. A lot of talk around authenticity, and these are been buzzwords, especially in the marketing world for so long.
yeah.
And it's funny because you can be such a, like, I consider myself very good at what I do and creating authentic connections with people through different channels, but with myself, being completely authentic, my whole self
Yeah.
is not something I've quite figured out yet. I can be my authentic professional self, authentic in different like discrete identities, but showing up completely as you are is a journey that I'm working on straight up.
Nah, I get it. I mean, I host a podcast on authenticity, right? This conversation, and I'm still working on myself. Like, there's still so
Yeah.
many things that I'm insecure about. And I'm wondering what it is for you. Like, what sort of strikes that fear, or that perception of risk, or danger. For me at least, some of it was the stories that I told myself in my head. But also, like, there were some real situations where I did open up, and I received some of those stereotypical, well, I was placing some of those stereotypes, right, in those buckets, right, in sharing. I went out on the weekends, people were like, oh my God, that's where you go. So what was it for you? What created that sort of that fear?
Well, I think it's like these unspoken cues. Like
Yeah.
the last job I was in before I took a leap and started my consulting practice focused on building DI into the foundation of brands. I was in working for a very iconic Americana institution, 100 plus years old, members in every zip code, um, at a very senior level, being essentially the voice and direct line of contact to our communities. And I was very sensitive to what different people's triggers were on, you know, it's a very politicized climate we live in. Everybody's very, there's a lot of divisiveness. And I saw how people like pounce on individuals and brands for speaking their truth and sharing their point of view. And I professionally, my role was like mitigate those risks. I oversaw community management, social media, all of the advertising, all of customer care. So hearing all the complaints. So I knew quickly kind of what type of responses you could elicit by being yourself and speaking your truth. Not me as an individual, but seeing what the reaction was when other people did it.
Could you give me an example? Like, what was
Oh
an
my
instance?
gosh, so many good opinions. Good examples. Well, in the workspace, like beyond what happens, like right on social media, a colleague of mine, he's excellent at what he does, comms professional, head of PR at the time. He also was the head of a punk rock band. He was signed to a label. He is openly gay. And, right-wing media got a wind of this. Some critics on social media got wind of this. It was code red in the office. He was being dragged on social. It bubbled up. It was like he was getting smeared, in Breitbart. Then it went all the way up to Fox News. And there was a show on Bill O'Reilly where we literally you know, had to navigate this, what was all of a sudden a brand reputational risk and sensitive issue because one of a top performing employee who had been dedicated to his job and over delivering for years was outed as being gay and a punk rocker. So I was like, that's not going to be me. So I was like, quick on the shut down the social, make everything private, be really careful about what you say. You can't say anything political, you can't say anything divisive. And simply saying I'm a feminist is divisive. Simply saying Black Lives Matter is divisive. Simply saying I believe in equity can be divisive. These are my core values. So I think it's really challenging, depending on your role, the visibility of that role, the brand you work for, to show up authentically.
First of all, thank you for sharing that story, that experience, and I think it's real, because what I always say too is that I think it's easier. Um, well, maybe it's not easier, but it becomes really difficult to be your authentic self at work because it's the bag. It's how you get the bills paid. It's how you support your family, yourself. I mean, some of us support our own mothers and fathers, our
Yeah.
grandparents, etc. So like you said, right, like it's a risk, and
It's your livelihood. It's not
yeah.
like, oh, and it's not something you just choose to do lightly.
Hmm.
And I think the environment you're in has to really embrace and welcome authenticity, and it has to be modeled at all levels of the organization, at the top, at the middle, at the entry level, to invite people to show up as who they are and to really create that sense of belonging. It takes a lot more than a pledge, a corporate policy, an update to an employee handbook. While all those things are very important, don't get me wrong, but there's that real life experience that people need to see and feel. And I just haven't operated in spaces where I feel safe to do so. And it's not like I live some double life and have much to hide, but yeah, there's stigmas associated with different backgrounds, and you don't want to be painted as a diversity hire. And I feel like
Mhm.
I've always had to hustle twice as hard, over deliver constantly, to shake that imposter syndrome, to feel like you belong. And I think working in marketing in the digital space, I've gotten a lot more ease relying on the numbers, because I have stats. I have the receipts of this is how many millions I brought in. This is
Yeah.
how many members. This is, how we optimize our ad buys. This is how productive videos increased. But it's still hard, even, yeah, for me.
I get it. I'd love to know, like, what are some things that you think you've hid previously, from your identity? And again, it's not like you're living. It's not like you're you're one person. It's not like you're Kayla by day and Batman by night. You know what I
Right.
mean? But what do you
But
think
I
are
do
some
have
things that?
superpowers, but no, just
Exactly.
I mean, grow, my dad, he worked in the music business.
Mhm.
He was a concert promoter. Um, I grew up going to shows. I grew up backstage. The dance hall reggae culture is part of my heart. Grew up in Miami, going to dance halls, going to hip hop parties, listening, going to DJ Khaled parties on a Friday night. He was our local, that was
He's
the
the
local spot,
he's the
hanging
local
out.
DJ.
It
That's
was,
crazy.
yeah, Friday nights at Madhouse. And that was high school, college, but I kept that separate. And then I went to and I had my scholarship, and then I was a National Science Foundation fellow, and getting, double master's degrees. And you just keep it separate. I could be on the dance floor at 3 a.m. on a Saturday night or a Friday night, and doing my school job, Monday at 8, taking full-time classes, having a part-time hustle, working in the agency. And I think you just keep all those things separate, because would they want, the girl on the full scholarship to be up in the club? I don't know, so you keep it separate. Yeah. So I think for me, it's you can be part of your real self in certain environments, but showing up as your whole multidimensional self, that's another level.
Yeah, I get that. I'm wondering too, in those situations, right? Because I'm sure people ask you, "Oh, what did you do this weekend?" Or, "Oh my God, what do you typically do for fun?" I don't know.
Right.
would
No,
you would
you're
you
right.
make would you make up a story? Like, what would you do in that instance?
I think it's selective information, oh, I had a great walk through Central Park. And, maybe you omit certain part of the story, or had a great night out with friends, connecting with, some old, coworker, it's just how you package it. I guess being in the marketing communications, I can frame and package something in a way that's palpable for the person on the receiving end. And I consider myself highly adaptable, a people person. So I can find common ground and connect with whoever. And I guess that's me making that effort, but I think there's less effort on sometimes the other have to find a way to genuinely connect per se.
100%. I always say, like, I wish they faked enthusiasm as much as we did.
Right.
Because like,
Like, good morning, Jim. How are you? You know?
well, whenever I say, something that I'm interested in, it usually ends the conversation versus I mean, sometimes I am curious, but sometimes I do fake it. I don't know, like, oh my God, I just went to, I don't know, on whatever trip. And I'm just like, oh my God, tell me more about it. Give me
Mhm.
recommendations and tips. Like whenever we say things, typically it's like the end of the conversation, and there's not necessarily an interest in some of our interests and passions as well. So yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering too, because now you're in this well, it's not like you haven't been doing DE and I work in the past, and but now you are a bit more dedicated from a time standpoint.
Academically, I have a background in race and ethnic relations as well as medical sociology. So really looking at systemic patterns and, what is it about society and somebody's life chances, opportunities to thrive in this world. We're all coming from a different background and a different place that impacts our opportunities and the privileges that we have. And I always, like have been committed to that work and I loved that space in academia, but I'm like, let's get it. I'm an action person. Let's change it. I couldn't be just in the research um world or academic world. So I also have a background in media relations and media management. I was like, our country like runs on media and advertising. It's the driver of culture, it's the driver of perceptions, it's the driver of attitudes. And if I want to change the world, it just seemed like an avenue to help advance my personal mission, which is to make the world a more equitable place. So I knew, right away that like I worked in the agency world. I did that grind, and I knew after I got my master's that I was going to find a way to leverage the power of media, the power of community, digital to drive that forward. And spent 10 years, working for some of the top nonprofits in the country, leveraging DEI to, meet our organizational objectives, to build community, to increase revenue, to increase membership, to drive advocacy and policy issues forward. And you can't do that without connecting and without that cultural awareness and without being in tune to people's needs, their desires, their wants. That's like 101 of good marketing and advertising is you have to deliver on somebody else's needs and their gaps and what they're looking for, um, and build trust, that basic brand trust and all of those things. So I've always used D&I as a vehicle to kind of advance the missions of the organizations I've served, which I've always been a mission driven person. And I think, like many people in 2020, I was doing a lot of reflecting and soul searching, and I just wanted to do more, quite frankly. I was fed up. I was like, um, working for a powerful organization and mission, but it wasn't enough. I was like, I want to do more. You have the skills, you have this talent, get it. And that's what I did. I quit my job and I said, I am going to focus squarely. It's not going to be like a hidden agenda of how do you build DEI into the foundation of a brand. I'm going to work with brands who are committed to living up to all those commitments they put out and all those pledges, to put in the work, to do some serious reflecting, to analyze their systems, analyze their policies, to take audit and stock of what's working and what's not, to really show up and be the change that they needed to be to steward in a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace, not just for their staff and talent, but for the constituents that they serve. If that's customers, that's donors, volunteers, whatever it may be, just take those words on paper and bring it to life.
Yeah. I love that. And it sounds like fascinating work. And it's almost like on two sides, right? Like on one side, it's like, what is the brand communicating? What is the brand illustrating visibly, right? More of those actions, but also I think you're having so many interesting conversations um, with the executives, right? That, look like you and I, and even they are struggling with authenticity. Like before we get into some of that brand work, like what are you seeing on an individual level and some of those challenges that we're discussing now?
It's funny, I'm working with an organization right now, the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, credible, storied organization, 70 plus years old. They're leading the fight against blood cancer, massive revenue, 500 million annual year, nearly 1,000 people on staff, a lot of really good people committed to curing cancer and advancing the mission, and working closely with their head of DEI, brilliant Black woman, credentials for days. And she just started wearing her hair natural in the pandemic. So it's like
Wow.
you can be chief diversity, equity, inclusion officer. Like I said, it's a journey for us all. She's just now feeling comfortable showing up to herself. So I think it's interesting. Like this is a journey for so many of us. And I think like a lot of the social happenings in the past year, the heightened focus on race relations and injustices and the social reckoning with systemic racism has kind of made people confront themselves and the environments that they're operating in, and think a little bit more critically of how they're contributing to it or not taking actions to stop the fuckery. Um, but I'm hopeful because I see a willingness and a commitment that I didn't feel before. I feel like even, like saying institutional racism or sexism was taboo in the workplace.
Mhm.
Just acknowledging it was taboo. And I think people are feeling more comfortable speaking on these issues, acknowledging them, saying that they're real. And when I say people, I'm talking about white people, like
Yeah, yeah,
Black
yeah.
people, people of color, like it's just a reality. It's not like this philosophical idea, but I don't know.
Oh,
On a on a tangent, I was like, what was the question again?
no, no, you answered it. You answered it. Well,
Okay.
I agree though. I remember when I first, not even first, but like I don't know, 2, 3 years ago, um, if an unarmed Black man was murdered in the street by police, no one would talk about it. Like leadership would just not even talk about it. The only people that would talk about it are these like internal Slack channels, if you will, or these internal group chats
Yeah.
where myself and people that look like me would have, and we were like, yo, how's everyone doing? Like we would check in on each other, right? And it wasn't until maybe when George Floyd happened, when leadership, like white people in leadership positions, actually started talking about it and holding space for people to just share their emotions, share how they're feeling,
Yeah.
and on a larger scale, even like maybe even give people like a mental health day, right? But even the mention of some of these situations, murders, etc., like were never even referenced,
No,
right? And I think it goes back to potentially, I don't know, they were fearful to have that conversation as well. Just yeah.
I don't even think, quite frankly, I don't think it was really top of mind of like even relevant.
Mm,
I don't even think it was like an issue that was relevant to their lives. And
mm,
people aren't always great at thinking, what are the other issues that, people who are different than me might be faced with or thinking about. And I think in the past year, it was whether leadership wanted to or not, I think there was pressure, societal pressure to
oh yeah.
acknowledge these things. And they did it even if it was against their gut feeling or what they felt comfortable doing, I think it was more of like a mandate.
Oh,
Like, if we don't do this, we're going to be tone deaf. If we don't do this, we can piss off our base. We can ostracize, our markets, compromise our market shares, whatever it is. Like, I think it became the in thing to do. Like, it became a new social norm, which is good. I just don't think it was natural and like
yeah,
this natural evolution from many white people in leadership. I think
I
it was like
agree.
a forced hand.
I agree.
And I
No, I
don't think
mean,
it's just about white people in leadership, like
no.
Latinos too, because there's so
Oh
much
yeah.
colorism and racism within the Latino community. Like, I've seen that firsthand as well.
I completely agree. Actually, something else that happened in the midst of George Floyd and a few other murders is that I saw like certain policies change, right? So, well, not like at a government level, but at a company level. Like I saw
Yeah.
managers starting to get graded on how inclusive their team felt
Oh,
or
well,
was, right? So
which
it
is
was,
great.
yeah, but it was impacting their bag, you know what I
Performance.
mean? And
Yeah.
that's why they really started caring. So yeah, I agree. It's like a larger macro level issue of like everyone wanting to hear what brands thought, but at the same time it was like, yo, now it's going to impact my performance review, you know?
Right.
Yeah, no, I'm curious too, right? Because we've spoken about a little bit about you, we've spoken a little bit about the work that you're doing and just like where we are in the world, but like where are you right now when it comes to authenticity? Do you still see it as a risk? Like what's your level of comfort with it?
So I feel like I'm in a good place. Leaving my last job was like a huge weight off my shoulders, even though it was hands down one of the best professional opportunities. I grew, I learned, I excelled, I met amazing people. I'm not discounting any of that, but
Mm,
not feeling like you're owned by a brand
mm,
and that what you do because of your level of seniority could potentially impact the brand or your job security. It's like a huge weight off my shoulders. And being unapologetically committed to DEI and working with people who value my expertise and my input is super liberating. Working with other people who honor me and see my value, and it goes both ways, just feels good at your core. So I'm in a good place because that's where I'm at, and it's a blessing because it's just easier to be rather than easier to be what you think somebody wants you to be.
yeah.
In social media, I'm not very active. So
Mhm,
I'm still on this journey thinking about how do I want to show up and
mhm,
what parts of myself am I willing to put out there.
mhm.
And that's, I'm sitting with that discomfort and working through that too, but in a good place overall, really good place.
Yeah, and also, not everyone deserves to see all of you, you
Yeah,
know. You don't have to
exactly.
do all of that.
Exactly.
But no, I love I'm getting goosebumps just hearing you say that you're in a better place because that makes me happy. And I don't know if you realize, but like by you being yourself, we spoke a little bit about this, right? But it's a ripple effect, right? One of my previous guests, Catalina Peña, said this, and it always stuck with me. It's describing the ripple effect, but she said, once you become or start to embrace your authentic self, you become a mirror for other people,
Yeah,
and they see themselves. It may not be everything, but they see a part of you in themselves.
for
And
sure.
yeah, so just know that you are inspiring people as well. But closing with this last question, you're not done, I'm not done, we're not done, everyone's continuing to grow. What's one thing that continues to empower and inspire you to continue growing in authenticity?
I mean, straight up building on what you just said, I love seeing others keep it real, persist, succeed. I love reading and hearing stories that feel vulnerable and beautiful at the same time. I think it's inspiring to see people, especially people of color, who are part of loving, supportive communities, who live and speak their truth, and they also thrive personally and professionally. To me, that's empowering. That's what I'm manifesting. That's what I'm trying to create for other people as well, not just for myself, but be part of that community, not be just a spectator. Being real and supporting others who are doing the same, that's inspiring and empowering for me. And especially if I can help somebody along the way, either by being a mentor or a sponsor, that's really motivating and a personal high for me. I love seeing other people succeed and soar. And if they can do it while being themselves, even better.